Ron?
We are.
I thought this morning maybe I'd start talking about the persona, the psychological self, and the identified human being and human persona and personality and emotion and all of that. Because I think in a normalcy and consensus reality type human functioning, it's very difficult to identify with that as being you. I mean, I am Peter Brown, I am, this personality and the thoughts and the opinions and all of this stuff, and all the emotional, patterns associated with that. And that whole constellation of event that I'm used to thinking of as me. And well, in short, it's not. What I really am, what you really are, is beyond that. That's not excluded or negated. That's a portion of you, but it's a portion of you like your hand is a portion of you. It's there, but it's, there's a whole lot more going on, and the hand doesn't tell the whole story. The problem in terms of yoga is it's commonplace, I think, within many traditions and probably for beginners as well, to approach yoga functionally as functioning from the persona. The persona is who wants to practice yoga. And the persona can't practice yoga. The persona can't do anything. It's pretty useless. It's sort of like the appendix, It's there, but it's like, what's really up with that? What does practice yoga is you can call it the true self, or the actual condition, which you actually are, that which is seeing your experience, and that which is creating your experience is what you are, and that is what practices yoga. So all of the contrivances and efforts and behaviors and enactments of the persona and of the personal self are essentially powerless. They're empty, empty motions. So what is powerful and where yoga actually occurs is in the primal self, the fundamental self, the actual self. So this being the case, well, let me back up a little bit. There's a curious kind of almost a schizophrenic coexistence, which becomes more and more apparent, of the persona, the psychological self, which exists and persists, coexists in the context of the greater self, which is vastly beyond it and fundamentally different in virtually every way. But these coexist, and they have vastly different perspectives, vastly different orientations, let's say. So, and it's tactically speaking, practically, it's expedient to let the personal self think it's doing something. It's like telling the kids to go out to play so that that keeps them busy, keeps them off the street, So it's all very well and good for the personal self to be all involved in spirituality and all involved in trying to do this, and trying to do that, and so on and so forth. But it basically is it's make work. It's not it's a lot like an image I see fairly often when I think of this is one of those child's toy car seats. It has a steering wheel and a horn, but the steering is of course not connected to anything, and so the child's sitting there, like this. They're driving along. The person not actually driving anything, but they're happy. They're playing around. They're doing their work. And the functioning of the persona is a lot like that. It is at the level of radiant presence that that there is power, that there is function, that there is engagement, powerful engagement. And from the point of view of the psychological self, that's almost invisible typically. I mean, yoga happens under the table. Yoga doesn't happen explicitly. It's very easy to, if you're engaged in trying to do, practices or spiritually oriented activities or something, and you're sort of keeping count and, well, how am I doing? And is it developing? Is it, you may or may not see anything, but it doesn't have anything to do with what really happens, because yoga happens under the table, and the development happens subliminally. It happens within the true self, within the primal self, not within the personality. Although there can be some trickle down in terms of symptoms and effects and so on. So in practical terms, this is an aspect that's I think useful to consider. So like we were talking about yesterday, simply any moment of being with your experience outside an interpretive framework is, first of all, you're engaging with your experience at the level of the fundamental self, because that's the way the fundamental self sees all experience. And secondly, that action is integrative. It kind of builds a bridge between these two different modes, and it's cumulative. But the integration and accumulation doesn't happen in the personal self necessarily, or not fundamentally that way. It happens in the foundational self. So that's an aspect of all this. It's very easy to approach all this with the theory of subtle bodies. You're all familiar with maps of chakra systems and channels and all these kinds of things, or in Hindu yoga where you have the channel, the chakras are also lokas, different universes and so on. Or in Buddhism they have different heaven realms and so on, the cumulative subtle realms that are beyond the lower realms and so on and so forth. And that's a revealing way to model all of this. I don't know that it's literally actually like that, but as a way of sort of mythologizing it, it implies how it is. You don't exist in one context alone. You exist in an infinity of contexts, each of which has its own different, simultaneously, and each of which has its own different perspectives and its own different dynamisms, its own different, dominant flavors of engagement and so on and so forth. And you function in all of these realms, although typically, because the identification for most humans is so heavy-handedly in the sensory realm and the realm of the persona, depending upon your nature, you may be much less aware of the functioning of some of these other realms. And the point of yoga is integrative. It opens the doorways between these realms, but it's peculiar because a realm is incapable of seeing beyond its own perspective. So, like the human persona will never be realized. It can't be realized because realization is a perspective that's beyond it. So, in realized being, what's realized is not the persona, not the personality. Personality exists and is there and may reflect aspects of that, a kind of resonance or trickle down, but it's not actually oriented there. So anyway, this aspect of the inconceivably broad range of the actual environment that you exist in is bewildering and daunting in terms of trying to make any sense of it, but is essential in yoga because one stumbles upon this fairly well in the course of things. One stumbles on these things and they don't make much sense if you approach it from within the normal context. You look at it and it just seems like very weird incoherences and so on and so forth. But that's only trying to look at looking at it from outside of its context or from within another context, and then it doesn't translate. The sort of, let's say, the inherent logic or inherent structure or mode of one realm doesn't translate to the inherent logic of another realm. So if you're used to identifying heavily within one realm, these other realms will seem very, very strange and peculiar, and maybe non-linear. Now, everyone has these experiences all the time, but because most of these other realms are so strange, and since they don't translate, it's just written off as distraction or weird vibes or just noise in the system, and it seems to be nothing. But exploration of these more subtle realms, subtle energies, is very revealing of the nature and the texture and the dynamism and bandwidth of radiant presence, which of course is your very embodiment, your very self. And as I started off by saying, the primary action of yoga is in these other realms. It's not in the realm that the persona, the normal sensory-oriented persona typically most dominantly focuses on.
And a desire for myself to keep it really simple, but what keeps coming up for me and is to learning to relax and be comfortable with. It's pretty much what you started off with yesterday, that there's really nothing. And where I go with that is there's some Longchen Rabjam Tantra, where it really goes into great detail about at the moment of birth, nothing is born, which somehow that just clears the decks for me psychically and on a subtle level to let go of trying to understand and like just the persona, or it's like I'm applying that to all the elements that at the moment of seemingly that they're born, nothing is really born. That the only thing that's ever been is presence.
Mm-hmm.
And everything that arises, my persona, my experience of my environment, that these are reflections of presence.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like the yoga that is really drawing me is to be comfortable without correcting in any way.
Yes.
The flow of seeming events in my inner world, and just the panorama of visual objects, the whole gamut of the smell, taste, that these are all reflections, but that they've never really been born.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is this on the same track of where you're going?
Well, it's generally very good. Strategically, not so much strategically. The best stance is loose, easy flow, non-grasping, non-holding. Don't hold anything to be anything. Yeah. Now, holding doesn't mean merely attachment to it. It also just means identifying it as being anything. So even holding that its reflections or not, no matter how subtly or loosely you're doing that, is a subtle kind of a holding. And so but it's very subtle and paradoxical, because you want to also be non-holding about non-holding. So you don't want to try to grasp onto non-grasping.
So there's no witness whatsoever.
Yeah.
That's what I'm hearing you.
There's nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing whatsoever.
Yeah.
But not in a way that negates or cancels anything.
Right. Right. Because that would be nihilistic.
Well, but yeah, I mean that, but whether or not it's nihilistic, it just happens not to be like that.
Sure.
But trying to talk about this is it's easy, but it's liable to be misconstrued.
Sure.
There's absolutely nothing, not because there's nothing, but because there's no thing that has any coherence to constitute an entity or a condition or a quality. And yet there's an infinite generosity and pregnancy of implication of all of that. It just never comes together into sufficient coherence to constitute an actual thing or condition or entity. And that's the sense that there's no thing. It's not a no thing as in a zero or nothingness. It's a no thing as in it's beyond thingness. It's beyond conditionedness. It's beyond being anything. Radiant presence is unresolvable. That's its, aside from its actuality, that's its primary quality. And unresolvability is a way of trying to express this same fact, that it doesn't cohere into anything. Doesn't cohere into anything, into any entity or any condition. It doesn't cohere into not cohering. It doesn't cohere into having motion. It doesn't cohere into not having motion. It just any way you try to say it's that, it doesn't resolve to actually being that. No matter how subtly and how witty you are about these incredibly delicate possibilities, but that's not findable either. Nothing is findable. Yeah. Nothing can be found. Nothing can be found. And yet, in the context of apparent seeming findings, there's being loose and easy with that apparent condition, because it's not because you don't want to orient, you don't want to have found that is bad, and you have to have an antidote towards it. Because as soon as you do that, then you're holding on to needing an antidote, which is a very profound holding. So you just loose and easy, completely unconstructed, completely laissez-faire. Which is basically what you said, so that's excellent. It gets endlessly fine. So, and some of the, I feel like with Longchenpa, for example, and some of the ways he puts things, it's just so exquisite. There's these gems of glorious beauty. But even that, and some of the images, reflections and these kinds of things, it's not actually that. Those are poetic evocations of something that is not that, because it's not anything.
As you go deeper into the yoga radiant presence, you know that there's no end to it. And
there's no end. No beginning, ends or beginnings, things, no things. There's no parameters can be found whatsoever. And
you are being magnetized to go deeper and deeper into this.
Well, there's no me. It is self-magnetized. Its very nature is to go into itself endlessly. It penetrates itself infinitely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the fundamental event. Yeah. To mythologize it. And that penetration of itself is all this. That this is what that looks like. But that's the only thing that's actually happening. And all of this apparition is just that, and has never become anything.
Thank you.
A rule of thumb, if anything seems to be any particular way, no matter how subtly, it's not. That becomes a target for yoga to see through it. If anything seems to be anything, no matter how inspiredly, how subtly, how perfectly, how incredibly, it's a wonderful revelation, but it's not true.
Does this still arise for you in your?
Oh, endlessly, but that's it. That's endlessly, but that's its dance with itself. Yeah. It generates seemings. It generates an infinity of seemings, which is its dance with itself. And the seemings aren't bad or wrong, and they aren't even problems. But the seemings are seductions that seduces itself into the seemings, which is the whole origin of delusion and so on. But that's always happening continually, fractally on every level, non-stop, beyond space and time.
It's where you were beginning, speaking of the persona and the different realms and the inner worlds of channels. When an individual begins, if there's a thought that it's real, and radiant presence is always present in that, no matter what the persona may be thinking about its situation, is this, I guess the world, it's like there's an aspect of that being an investigation or a presence trying to figure out who it is.
Oh yeah, it's all good. There's no wrong moves. Typically, the dance of experience consists of getting caught up with something and holding it to be real, and you dance with it, and then it morphs into something else. And depending on the arc of your unfoldment, you will harvest some degree of awareness that wasn't it. as you saw it, as you move into the next thing, and so on. I mean, this is just sort of the ongoing dynamism.
There are seemingly infinite beings investigating infinite possibilities, and this is presence trying to figure out
That's all that's happening.
its dance.
Presence is very curious about itself, and this is its exploration. And all of this weirdness and getting seduced into things and then seeing through it and all of this is just the dynamism of that dance. And there's no wrong moves, there's no mistakes. Doesn't matter where you go, that is your yoga, that is your engagement. And the art of yoga is to be with it as efficiently as possible. There's nothing but yoga. I mean, the most deluded person wandering around in their personal hell, that's yoga. That's radiant presence exploring itself. But it's doing it in a sort of a heavy, relatively inefficient mode. So yoga is taking advantage of the fine print, taking advantage of the possibility of breaking the rules and rather just muddling along karmically, endlessly, and slogging through the muck. You discover, oh, wait a minute, I'm doing this, but there's no rule here that I have to. There's no rule that I can't look through it and discover that it's not actually there. And so the yogi takes advantage of this lack of rules to break the rules that most people think are in force, and as a result discovers alternate orientations which reveal a lot more freedom and joy and dynamism and possibility for yet further refinement.
Seemingly there is hope and fear in the manifest state, but simultaneously presence never really experiences hope and fear except through these reflections to see where it'll go.
Yeah, everything. I mean, everything is not actually that without needing to be negated or canceled. But the art of yoga is sort of the time lag or the gap between that you see through it. If you're a low level yogi, it might be lifetimes. I imagine going through, all this stuff, but that gap, that sort of refresh rate can accelerate, and in the case of a high yogi, a very skilled yogi, that refresh rate becomes instantaneous. So as soon as you see the condition, you already see through it. Rather than you see the condition, you get whammied by it, and then But that's that kind of the gap, the time lag of recognition is kind of it can be said to be the gauge of the skillfulness of a yogi. But again, it's what it is. It can't be other than it is. But it's kind of a rule of thumb way of noticing what's going on. And in liberation, it becomes virtually instantaneous, where the arising is the liberation. It's seen to be liberated right away, rather than there being an arising and various degrees of karmic mucking about, and then the liberation of seeing through it. That again, depending on the time lag of the gap, will be whatever it happens to be, depending upon the unfoldment of the yogi.
Self-liberation of everything that arises.
Because everything is intrinsically liberated, and the realization that is known, so there's no time lag. The arising is just the presentation of the liberation. But I'm loath to use the Dzogchen terms. Not in this case, they're rather concise. By liberation, it means that it's not really that. It's really unresolvable. So whatever seems to appear is not really that. It's liberated from being what it seemed to be.
Yeah.
That's what it means, the liberation refers to.
No reification of anything.
Yeah, exactly. It's about reification.
Yeah.
And that's the inherent self-awareness of radiant presence.
Yeah.
I mean, every moment radiant presence is tricking itself and seeing itself. And,
Yeah.
and yogi has less blocks.
Yeah.
You know, till eventually there's no block.
Yeah. Well, I would put it as blocks so much as inefficiencies or clumsinesses, but yeah, basically.
But there's some kind of veil that we, you know, it's like, well, we don't want to see it. We don't want to, I mean, I don't know.
Well, the identification is very strong. There's a tendency of complacency, of settling in the familiar. And that's a very strong force, I think. It's a force to be reckoned with. And I think that this is, you know, I often say in these talks that reality is very easy to see. Unreality is very hard to let go of. You know, and this is basically what we're referring to here. And that can manifest in any sort of context and to any degree. And it's so subtle because, you know, again, it has nothing to do with what is done. So if you're getting lost in, getting seduced by experience into holding things a certain way, well, I said another one. Okay, it's not about not getting caught in experience. It's about seeing that even getting caught in experience is not getting caught in experience. So even reifying something is not actually reifying something, because the entire thing is entirely intrinsically liberated. So even being stuck in delusion is not being stuck in delusion.
It's all the play of presence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a again, and this we're talking about yoga at a very advanced level. We were talking a little bit yesterday about sort of the trajectory of yoga into two phases or two halves. I don't know. I guess we were talking about that. I don't remember.
I mentioned it.
Yeah, and in the first half, yoga feels very much like you're trying to get away from something. You're trying to refine something. You're trying to, you know, get out of the muck, get out of the whatever. And in the second phase, you're sort of going back into that, revisiting it, and seeing the way that is this. And so basically, you let yourself settle back into delusion, but you're seeing that the delusion is transcendental radiant presence. And so, but there's no limit to how far you can. It's not like you're supposed to settle into the delusion and taste it and then go out where it's safe. It's like, no, there is no safe. It's all safe. It all is radiant presence. So at that point, delusion, schmallusion, you know, you just go swim in the shit, you know, go, you know, roll drunks and hang out in bars and, you know, whatever. Who cares? Because it all really is radiant presence. And even you don't even need to see that it's radiant presence. Because even all of these insights of yoga are no more superior to the dullness of delusion and non-recognition. But that's a very high level of yoga. So the highest yoga is no yoga at all. Very funny.
There are a lot of stories about some of the greatest practitioners. They never learned to read or write.
Hmm.
Didn't matter, and yet they really knew it. They knew the yoga presence. They were.
There was a revered yogi in this tradition years ago I was involved with who would sit behind the temple where everybody would go poop, and if anybody came and wanted to ask him some profound question, he'd throw shit at him. And he was really considered quite realized, and there's good aim.
You workshop idea.
One hopes he was realized.
He was just unapproachable.
People who are bumbling around with no idea or no inclination towards any of this is, just as well off as any of us. Trying to get something.
At the end of yoga is normalcy. The end of yoga is the normal, same old, same old. The path of yoga takes you through the extremes of inconceivable magnificence, and at the end deposits you back into complete normalcy.
Whatever that is.
Well,
I'm always trying to figure out what's normal.
it's easy to find out what's normal, just complete yoga and then you'll know. Because when you are then, that's what's normal. I guess by normalcy in this context, I mean non-inflation. Non-inflation of self-importance or self-aggrandizement. Not necessarily egoically even, just in terms of just any importance whatsoever.
Yeah.
Normalcy is nothing has any importance. Nothing has any importance at all. And the path of yoga takes you through every extreme of importance. You become God. There's just absolutely no limit to the extremes of importance that the path of yoga takes you through. But where it drops you off, it is no importance. And of course, you never really left that.
So you'd say that the extremes are what you would call non or abnormal. Abnormalcy or something.
No. Normalcy or not or abnormalcy are not really important at all. It's just a term of phrase.
But the return to normalcy, it's when nothing means anything. Can
It's
you
not that
see-
it doesn't mean anything. You go searching through all possibilities of reality and see what's there, and you discover ultimately that none of them hold anything that's any more special than anything else. And so then you let go. And when you let go, you're deposited to where, you know, your spontaneous arc of gravity deposits you. And that's just fine, because that's as good as anything.
And that's what you're calling noise.
Non-specialness.
Right.
Because you've done the math, you've gone, you've explored all the subtle realms and everything, and looked for the most profound, the most important, the most valuable you can find. And ultimately, you don't find anything, any place that's any better than any place else. And so wherever you are, this is it. Whatever condition it is, this is it. It doesn't need to be one way or another. So then you just are whatever you happen to be.
Would that correlate with the fourth vision, the sort of exhaustion of all phenomena back into what is? Is that
Probably loosely, yeah, sure.
interesting?
I mean, I think the serious Togel is probably a special case. It's kind of a specialized athletics competition where if you don't get the body of light, you're an also ran. But from the point of view of liberation, it's irrelevant whether or not you get a body of light, because you discover you've always had one. There's nothing else. And so the manifestation of that is beside the point.
Beyond achieving.
Yeah, and all that's fine, of course. But it's just a matter of if, because if the karmic expression looks like that, so you look like you're this guy and you've been sitting in the mountains for 10 years and you come down and you tell your friends you're dying, sew me up in a tent, and your body turns to light. Okay, cool. If it looks like that, that's great, but that's just an apparition. It's not any different than anything else. It's not any different than living in the Bronx and being an accountant, and drinking a martini every night when you come home. It's just a different karmic. It's a different visual picture. It's a different karmic apparition. But the content is the same. And the point of yoga is to discover that sameness, not necessarily to go for the golden, be the rock star. On the other hand, if that's where your karma goes, then hey, more power to you. I mean, bodies of light are good PR.
But is that maybe being a body of light or being able to do that, wouldn't that constitute some form of purification of karma where it's a choice? I guess from a karmic standpoint, you decide to make a choice to go to that level. Hopefully, I don't know.
Sure, maybe so. But again, karma doesn't need to be purified because it doesn't really exist. So, but on the other hand, you're free to have a purifying your karma. So you kind of get it both ways. In other words, you can do that, and it may be that, but you don't actually gain anything by doing it.
I guess the only thing, where I was going was, instead of by purifying or choosing to go that level, instead of reincarnating back into some samsaric situation or a realm where I don't know what's beyond that. I don't know, any of those things, but I'm just trying to understand why there would actually be a process to actually want to attain those levels.
Well, there's a tradition, I mean, one thing that reinforces it is the tradition of within Buddhism. You know, there's a whole sort of a template of what's supposed to happen, and you know, the sort of, you know, it's like, you know, you hit the thing that knocks the ball up the thing, and you want to get all the way to the top and ring the bell. You know, purified karma, no new incarnation, you know, nothing but discarnate Buddhahood, you know, pure Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, you know, and bang, you run the bell, great. But that's, whether or not that occurs, let's say karmically, in terms of what it looks like, liberation comes from what it is, which is independent of what it happens to look like. So it may or may not look like that, and you can still be liberated or not, and liberation completely purifies all karma because you discover there is no such thing, without needing to negate it, because there's nothing to negate.
That's why I guess Dzogchen is the path of liberation, because
You discover that fact. So Dzogchen very directly directs one to discover the fact that reality is pure and perfect intrinsically. It cannot be sullied. And so everything whatsoever is that. Even if it seems otherwise, those seemings are inaccurate. And they can be seen to be inaccurate, because if you just by looking at them and seeing what they actually are, you discover that they aren't what they seem to be. So you can prove it to yourself. It's not something you need to take on faith. You can verify. You can do the math yourself. You can. Well, is it true that none of this stuff is resolvable? You know, hey, really, you know, give it the acid test. Be very skeptical. Say, well, maybe this is all bullshit. And look for yourself and see. Can I resolve anything? Is there anything with any stability or permanence or duration in experience that I can find anywhere? Good luck. And so the conclusions of Dzogchen are inescapable, not just logically, although that, but also experientially. You know, we're speaking in the context of Dzogchen now, which I'm not really technically authorized to do, but what I present is one and the same thing as that, which is basically the nature of actuality. And the tradition of Dzogchen doesn't have a monopoly on actuality. Obviously, actuality is smeared everywhere.
it sounds like it is actuality.
Yeah, Dzogchen presents the nature of actuality. So anything that presents the nature of actuality will essentially be cognate with Dzogchen. Although there may be divergences in some of the points of some of the ways it's emphasized and how it's put. But the way it's put, of course, is not important. It's what it is that matters.
Right.
And that's the whole point. And within Dzogchen, I'll tell you that too, you know. It's what it is. It's not the teaching, it's what the teaching is about.
Since we are speaking or sort of reflecting on Dzogchen in relation to what you've been speaking of, you reflected very briefly on the three kayas yesterday, and Dharmakaya, or emptiness, seems to be, you're using this word unresolvability, which is quite a wonderful perspective on that. And Nirmanakaya is like this infinite expression of radiance presence, it seems. But could you say a little bit more about the radiant aspect, the Sambhogakaya aspect, the clarity aspect?
Well, one has to explore it for oneself. In a certain sense, Dharmakaya and Nirmanakaya are kind of obvious. And in a profound sense, yoga is the exploration of Sambhogakaya. Yoga is the exploration of subtle energies and dynamisms, transcend the apparent stability that is more of a Nirmanakaya aspect. I mean, one could define yoga as realizing the Sambhogakaya. You know, but
Can you explain those?
it's not important. It's you know, I don't use those terms because, first of all, they're not true, because they're presented as if there's three things and they aren't really. So I don't bother with all that. But nonetheless, what it refers to is true. But I try to avoid that way of putting it because again, you sort of, well, which one's this and which one's that and what's the difference between them? You know, and it kind of takes the air out of that balloon and you say, well, there really is no difference. It's like, well, then what are we talking about?
And yet you are in a way emphasizing that aspect by saying radiant presence as opposed to unresolvable presence.
It's not an emphasis. It's pointing out that presence never shows up naked. Presence always is a barrage, an infinite barrage of apparent qualities, of seemings, of implications.
Expression, yes.
Yeah. And you know, this is just empirical. You know, just look for yourself. You know, you will never find absolute zero, plain zero. When you find zero, it will actually look like some non-zero presentation of zero-ness. But radiance and presence aren't separate. They're two words, but they're not separate. Presence is radiance, and radiance is present. Presence is radiant, radiant is present. It is just this. Now, all of that is just this. And really nothing more needs to be said. So this is this. This is not what it seems to be. This is inconceivably transcendent absolute reality. Check it out. I mean, that right there is the entire thing. And all of the minutiae of this, that, and the other is fine as a way of sort of poking into corners. But you know, again, none of that actually is anything. It's just at best, it's just experience of exploring this.
Right, and we are looking into our actual experience.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
in direct
It's essential.
experience, where
Yes,
all of
it's
those are
essential.
showing up.
It's essential.
Yeah.
Your experience is the only thing that matters at all for you. And so that's the whole point of all this stuff. And all of the philosophy and spirituality and techniques and all that are just, you know, useful experience, you know, potentially useful experience that you can use in the course of this exploration. But the only thing that exists is the thing itself and your engagement with it, which is it. It is intrinsically a self-engagement, and your engagement with it is actually its engagement with itself. And the point of yoga is to discover that fact, to discover that you are it.
Everything leading to that is skillful means, and challenge is not to get lost in all the words, all the fingers pointing at the man.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this here, it has no parts, it has no components, it has no subsystems, it has no aspects. It's exactly just this, you know. And so all this minutiae that you can say and think about it is not true. And it may be interesting and useful, but it's only interesting and useful to discover that it's not true. The value of any teaching is to see the way that it's not true. The value of any practice is to see the way you didn't need to discover the way you didn't need to do it. The value of meditation is to discover that you don't need to meditate. The value of anything is to ultimately invalidate itself until it's all stripped away. It strips it away from itself, and what are you left with? What you started with, you know. But all this dynamism, all this running around is not like that's bad or anything. That's what it looks like. That's what it does with itself. It endlessly dances with itself, and it just, you know, has the most weird, peculiar Baroque steps in its dance.
So go ahead and dance, but don't think that that's going to get you anywhere, or that that it means anything, right?
Yeah. Well, you know, if you're interested, you can, you know, bring intelligence to it, and rather than doing it dully and stupidly, You can do it with wit and subtlety and observation, reflection, and participate in the finest aspects of it, just as as an art form.
When you, I hear you talking about Saturn having an impact on
Mhm.
What are you talking about?
I have no idea. I just look at my computer and there's these little signs, and I know this one's supposed to be Saturn, and I know its lines seem to be lined up to this one, and I'm feeling crappy, and so I blame it on that. And then I start feeling well, and there's a little sign markers moving in my computer, and it's like, oh, that's why.
So in that instance, are you like, yeah, that's a lie, that's, this is just making stuff up, it's just.
So it's not a lie. It's just not. It's just I don't know what it is.
But, I mean, perhaps it was said as if it were the truth, and then, so you're aware, so you're like, no, yeah, no, that's just more noise.
Well, that it actually is any particular way is noise.
Mhm.
The thing itself is just the weirdness of the weirdness. I mean, why is it sunny today and why was it thundering yesterday?
I guess the words that people say are, I'm looking at you as if you're going to be saying the truth, or something that's really like, there you go, boom.
I'm trying to say
Then you
the
say
truth.
stuff about Saturn, I'm like, I have no Saturn.
But Saturn actually, okay, let's talk about truth. Exists as an observation of a little point of light that seems to be out there in the sky. And that little point of light seems to be localized relative to the other little points of light around it in various ways, in a way that involves constant motion. And some people notice the different ways these lights come in and out of alignments. It is empirical. You can just look up in the night sky and say, yeah, there's Saturn.
I don't see it now, though.
No, right now it's sort of a little hard to see, I guess.
So a lot of times there's the experience of all I see is this, and then it's kind of seen, and then there's other stuff is separate, there's other stuff.
But that other stuff is separate.
It's not all linked, I mean, this is linked together, the visual field is linked together. But the movement is sort of felt not sometimes I'm all stuck in it and however I am, but sometimes there's my visual field, there's movement within it, and then there's sensations.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm just like, Saturn, what are you talking about?
Well,
Jeff was saying there's like concentric circles of something that maybe you're pointing to, and I'm like, maybe there is, but I don't have that.
Well, there's, people may talk about something that you may not be able to correlate with something in your experience, but in the mind of the person who you're talking to, they may be referring to something that actually does appear within your experience, but they're just not being clearly enough to convey the correlation to you, so you don't connect what they're talking about with this particular aspect of what you're experiencing as a possibility. So, in other words, just because something doesn't make sense doesn't necessarily mean that it's gibberish. It may be that it actually refers to something that you do experience, but you're somehow not drawing the correlation to see. Because this is one of the major hurdles. And, it's really the whole brunt of what I try to do in these talks. It's really a major hurdle to try to correlate all this information with actual experiential qualities. You feel something, or you experience something, and it's just there. It's whatever it is. And then people have all these words they throw around that are supposed to have something to do with that. And it's like, well, but here's this word. What what exactly is that supposed to be related to that I'm actually feeling, that I'm actually seeing? And it's a real issue. So just because something doesn't make sense doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true or not valuable. It might be a problem of translation into knowing what the fuck they're talking about.
There's an old Tibetan saying, Dzogchen, if you know one thing, you know everything. And to me, that applies what Beth is referring to, that she knows that there's this presence, your radiant presence, Rigpa. And if you know that really with confidence, then you know everything, but you may not be able to identify with it from the point of view of your persona. And that's okay. You still know what it is. It just doesn't, it's not part of your karmic constellation.
Everyone knows what it is. It's just really obvious.
We know and we don't know.
Well, the problem is everyone knows what it is, but everyone also tends to think what it is, and what they think is not true. What is here cannot be thought. But what is here is really obvious, so everyone knows reality. Reality is not concealed, but it's not what you think it is.
Well, it all seems to be sometimes very separate. Like thoughts are one thing, the visual field is one thing.
Yeah, well, they are separate. They are separate in the sense that they're not connected, but they're unified by appearing in your experience. So they're different flavors of your experience, even if they, are not in any way,
It
interlinked.
seems like anytime it's connected, at another point you're looking at it, yeah, it's not true.
I'm sorry, I didn't follow that.
Anytime where the visual field and the thought and whatever seems to be connected, and there seems to be two dots connected in a story, at another time you're like, yeah, that must not be, this is not true.
Well, it's never true. There's never any actual connection. That's part of the weirdness of it all. Everything's like one of those pointless paintings where there's just billions of dots, billions of little flashes, and they're not connected. But if you back up a certain way, they all sort of seem to form these lumps and patterns and seem to be connected. But if you look very closely, all they're just little dots that have nothing to do with each other. That's the truth. And so all of this drawing connections is just free associating on information that has basically no connection to it. No existence, autonomous existence in itself, and no interconnection in any way other than the fact of coexistence.
That can be very liberating.
It is.
Isn't part of this the understanding that we are our own universe? And so we're trying to make two universes communicate. And really my words and your words could be miles and miles apart, even if we're using the same sounds. And so I think when you get into the whole truth thing, you really get into the conundrum of language.
Of course.
In terms of how you can communicate with someone else, ultimately.
The communication never happens. At best, like if we talk, you'll hear my words, and somehow you'll have some meaningful experience out of that, which there's no reason to suppose it has any correlation whatsoever with what I thought we were talking. And likewise, hopefully, I'll have some sense of meaningfulness from what I perceive from you. But again, there's no reason to expect it has anything whatsoever to do with what you thought we were doing. It's like two people looking like they're dancing together, but they're actually, it's just a coincidence of synchronicity. They're actually dancing alone.
I'm just bringing that up, so that's why Saturn makes no sense to you, possibly,
Two people makes no sense. I'm like,
I'm with you there.
I'm constantly arguing.
I'm not alone here.
Well, the word true is, or truth is kind of misleading because upon awakening, you see what true actually means. And it's not about perception. Can you put it that way?
Sure, true is being. True is what it is. And that can never be said. So a true statement is a contradiction in terms. Or a true communication is a contradiction in terms. On the other hand, conventionally, the idea of a true statement is to artfully try to evoke what is the actuality that does exist in a way, in a meaningful and effective way to some degree. And it's an art form that has, rather than an absolute condition of true or not true. And experience tells me that communication can be valuable. Communication can be, well, valuable, I'll just leave it at that. You know, and regardless of the fact that it's impossible to say anything, doesn't mean that it can't possibly be valuable to communicate.
Is this the world of fuzzy logic and physics?
Maybe, I'm not familiar with that. It's certainly the world of fuzzy logic and hanging out in the living room talking. I mean, you know, this is sort of my bread and butter, because what I sort of do is talks, right? And I'm sitting here talking about something that cannot be talked about. And so I'm constantly, I mean, I'm inconceivably, intimately aware of this whole paradox, you know. But the fact is that communication is an energy dance, and most of it has very little to do with words that are said. And the power of communication, certainly in this context, in the context of you know, a yoga presentation, it basically has nothing to do with words. You know, it's a multidimensional psychic engagement, subtle energy engagement.
It's really hard to put words on experience, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it's impossible. Yeah. But if you're artful, still, and all words can be used evocatively. You know, but it's always a dance, it's always a challenge, it's always an approximation. So it's more of an art form than a science, I'd say.
Can you say something about a useful, artful, wordless exploration when whether you're looking at subtle energies or whatnot in your experience, versus something that's more heavy-handed and sloppy, sort of, I guess, the typical way we
sure.
kind of look at the experience.
Feel the fineness, find the finest sort of vibrational quality, whatever that means, that you can, that's occurring in an event, and feel what that feels like. And feel the way that may resonate with other finenesses elsewhere. And notice that the finenesses exist in a context of other things that seem more coarse, but there's not necessarily one-to-one correlation, or certainly not necessarily. There's a lot of kind of smearing and perhaps seeming irrelevance or disconnection. But don't worry about that. So find the finest frequencies you can in the context. So like right now we're talking. So you know, I'm seeing you and you're just sitting there, and I see the color of your clothes, and you know, blah blah blah, the whole deal. Regular sensory, obvious perception. But in the course of this conversation, there's a lot more than that present. And so what do I mean by that? What kind of more? Well, there's sort of flavors, there's vibes, there's moods, there's, you know, you can't qualify them or classify them, but it's actual experientially. So you can let yourself turn into, sort of direct your attention to those finer textures, sort of, and just feel what they're like. And in the course of that, you learn how to do it better, and you find more, and you find interconnection, and you find, portals to other kinds of realms of texture, so on and so forth.
Without necessarily trying to make a meaning out of it.
You do not make a meaning out of anything. It's just to approach it like you would approach a piece of abstract art in a museum. You just have no idea what it is, but it's something, and feel what it is. Think of it as texture or flavor. Approaching experience texturally is a very good strategy across the board in yoga.
What do you mean by texture?
Well, you have to find for yourself what you mean by texture. What it feels like, what the presence of it feels like. So colors have texture. For example, what you think of as textures have texture. So I look at your face and there's a certain, I see the light reflecting, and I see, slight imperfections in different shades of color, and portions are more shiny than other portions. And so right there's a very obvious kind of a texture. But then there's more subtle textures of flavors and moods and vibes. I mean, a really good practice in training in subtle energy is reading people's auras. So you can be in a room like this, or in a cafe, or just on the street, and look at different people and notice how they feel different. You don't even need to spend much time on it. You look at someone and right away you got a hit on them. Right away there's the flavor. It's like you just feel it's like, I mean, it can't be verbalized, but it's really quite obvious. And just attending to that and noticing that fact, the more you attend to it, the greater your sensitivity and clearer your perception of it will become. And then you'll know, and that opens the doorway to acknowledging more kinds of explicitly psychic interconnections and psychic realms of flavor and dynamism and interaction. And all of which is already occurring. Everyone's doing this all the time, but typically, again, we center it out of our awareness hypnotically to sort of, as part of dumbing things down, to maintain a simplified interpretive framework of what we are and what we're doing in life.
Or we just bucket it into something called intuition.
Yeah, some people do that. Some people, what intuition? Show me intuition. I don't have no damn intuition. I don't know. I mean, consensus reality is largely censorship. There's a vast experience. The experiential field is an inconceivably vast spectrum of textures. And the portion that is attended to, I would speculate, as an average in most consensus reality orientations, is like a tiny little portion of this vast spectrum. But it's not that it's not being experienced; it's that it's being censored out of experience by being held to be irrelevant. It's held as just noise in the system, or boy, I was distracted, or boy, I'm kind of fuzzy-headed today. Well, where's this fuzz? If you're fuzzy-headed, what is the fuzz? Check out the fuzz. Maybe the fuzz is interesting. And then that opens the door, and all of a sudden you're in a universe of fuzz. And wow, that's interesting. What does that universe lead to? And so on and so forth.
I appreciate if you'd expand on that. That's very interesting. Speaking of consensus reality, essentially being censorship.
Mm-hmm.
And in the context of presence, it is the consensus reality that we are um, comfortable and familiar. This is where we're supposed to be, with this, or this is where we're choosing to be for safety, or
I don't know. I think it's a lot of both of those. I don't know. It's not so much conscious choice. It's a knee-jerk reaction of safety and conformity. Humans are tribal creatures, and I think we're powerfully motivated to imitate the people around us, to mirror the people around us.
Yeah.
So, a child raised in a culture will all of a sudden tend to embody the behavioral traits of the culture and body language of the culture and all that just spontaneously. And all of that is a kind of an entrainment of censorship of, oh, this is how it's supposed to be, this is normal, this is safe, this is what I am, and it's dangerous to be other than that. Because, again, in the context of survival, in the context of being a member of the tribe, it's dangerous to be not in the tribe. Because the tribe is your security base. The tribe feeds you and protects you, and so on and so forth. So it's threatening to be a heretic, to go outside of it. I mean, just, genetically or, socio-evolutionarily or whatever.
this maybe perhaps I'm probably projecting meaning onto it. It occurs to me that there's compassion involved with just the safety of the consensus reality, and even though who we are at a core level it's a vast universe, and yet out of a sense of nurturing, caring, that presence, this consensus reality is perfect for you until you get uncomfortable here, and then it's okay to start exploring. But this is kind of like a safety zone.
Sure. It's like kindergarten.
Yeah.
From the yoga point of view, it's like kindergarten.
Okay. Yeah.
It's perfectly well and good until you stop wearing diapers and start being interested in girls or boys, and all of a sudden kindergarten is no longer appropriate because you can't fully enact or explore what's going on in that context.
Kind of extending on that a little bit, so just the sense that their presence has compassion for the illusions that all of its creations have about it.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't, but to me, presence loves itself. Presence support. Presence knows that it's all presence, and it knows it's all itself. And presence is totally head over heels in love with itself. So, I mean, I think the partializing it as specifically as compassion is unnecessary or redundant. I feel I've been letting time fly. We should take a 5-minute, 15-minute break now, because otherwise it's going to be lunchtime.
I was thinking about that, but it's interesting.
I just want to party, Peter.
Hey,
Yeah.
I think I'd like to talk a little bit about hypnosis and hypnotic mechanisms. Practically speaking, it's very important to notice that the incredible responsiveness of mind to suggestion. It's the dominant internal mechanism that generates interpreter frameworks, as well as being one of the dominant means of manipulating other people. And it's omnipresent in all human thought and communication, which consists of these seeds of seeming ideas. And the mind is very, very obliging. When the mind is given an idea, first thing it does is it takes that idea and tries to simulate it, tries to create a virtual, what would it feel like if that was true? And if it does it powerfully enough, it'll feel like it really is true. So you'll notice it's a lot in communicating with other people. A lot of times in groups, there's a lot of manipulative techniques that are used. It's not necessarily maliciously, but it is manipulative, where people will say, well, we're all such and such, and all of a sudden, right away, the mind tries to go, oh yeah, okay, great, yeah, it must be true, yeah, and right away, whatever's being said sort of becomes a virtualized, felt sense of things being that way. Now, this isn't bad, this isn't the problem, but it's a mechanism that is important to notice and be aware of because it's constantly in operation in mind. From the point of view of a yogi, it's especially practical because hypnosis is the main means of navigation within the experiential field. You change your attention by pretending that you can, by telling yourself you can. Now I'm going to look at such and such, and just by saying that, you're basically planting a hypnotic suggestion, which the mind tries to actualize and virtualize. A large part of which is fantasy, but the building blocks of the fantasy that it uses is of course actuality. So this is actually can be very effective. Like we were talking about, I said, reading people's auras. Well, I don't know how to read an aura. Just do it. How do you do it? By doing it. It's like, okay, now I'm going to read your aura. And by saying that, there's a little hypnotic seed planted in the mind, and the mind generates an aura. And so on and so forth. Or, now I'm going to go to the astral plane. Now I'm going to direct my attention to the astral plane away from the physical plane. Bang. And these kinds of things. So anyway, so this kind of, becoming aware of the nature of this spontaneous, eager, hypnotic quality of mind can be very useful for the individual in terms of exploration and taking advantage of it, or tweaking your own mind state for convenience. And secondarily, it can be very useful. You can become aware of its use in your relations with other people, and you'll notice the way that communication is always more or less a dance of hypnotic suggestions. And of course, all kinds of argument and dominance and manipulation, all kinds of these things are affected through this mechanism. And even just having a thought, like someone comes up to you and starts talking about something, right away the mind tries to seize upon it as if it tries to create that as relevant. Even if you hadn't heard it, you might not have been thinking it, and it would be nothing to you. But all of a sudden the mind creates it as relevant because it's been given to it as something that is something, and so on and so forth. Anyway, you can look for yourself and just sort of try and become aware of this mechanism, because it can be very interesting to notice, in all sorts of contexts where any language is used, or non-verbal but similar sort of thought construct.
So it can be like a hypnotic induction to really be clear that one wants to liberate illusion.
Sure, absolutely.
And then this would be a yoga.
Yeah, you have to take it all with a grain of salt though, because a large part of the hypnotic mechanism generates fantasy, which is fine, but obviously fantasy exists in the context of actuality, and often the fantasy borrows from the elements that are actually present. And so if you're discriminating and sensitive, you can still use that without necessarily just jumping off into gaga land.
To me, it seems like that could be really useful just in enjoying one's existence.
Oh, very much, very much. Yeah.
So you're not caught in any particular phantom.
Yeah, you can tweak your status vis-a-vis other people. Sort of prime yourself when you're being with other people to be receptive to them, or to be disconnected from them, or whatever the context is. Mm-hmm. Or actually you can kind of tweak your own mood and all kinds of things like that. But the point of this isn't a course in hypnosis. The point is to notice that this mechanism is always in force. The mind is eager. The mind is like a slut for hypnosis. The mind's just saying, give me a suggestion so I can actualize something. And so it sees anything, one little seed, and it just grabs it, and all of a sudden, you're living some version of that. It feels like there's something like that all of a sudden going on for you. And so being aware of that enables you to not be, to use it to dance with it intelligently rather than just be subject to it passively.
It's pretty much what happens in a dream state, isn't it? When you have a waking dream, or like this, but like actually a sleeping dream where something will pop in and then the mind will just race with it.
Sure, yeah, dreams are basically generated by the same thing, but the content of the dream, the form, there will be some subtle seed of a concept, and then the fantasy, the hypnotic mechanism seizes on the raw light aura of the dream and concretizes it into whatever forms seem to be enacted by so on and so forth. Sure.
It's kind of like a lucid dream. That's where it can go very, very easily.
Well, it goes.
Where a thought or a memory can get almost kind of concretized into a lucid dream. Seems like that.
Well, it can get concretized into a dream, whether or not it's lucid. What I'm thinking about now is trying to see the relationship between lucidity and this mechanism, and I'm not sure it shakes out clearly for me one way or the other. Mm-hmm. But the mechanism of lucidity, that insight of, it's the interjection of or access of the critical faculty which empowers you to assess that it's a dream. Whereas if that critical faculty is not present, then the dream is just accepted at face value as actual. And I'm not sure what's up with that. But anyway.
Would you say that seeing that the hypnosis is happening to you and by you, in a sense, and seeing what the fact of that sort of breaks you out of that whole dream? I mean, what makes you become lucid in this?
I'm not sure that it's like that though, so I don't know. And it's not really particularly important anyway, but I mean, feel free to play with that.
Well, the idea of lucidity, it's almost like it isn't a given. It has to be brought into the situation.
Yes.
And that's what you were saying before the break about, like the pointing out instructions come from someone else. They come from the radiant present, self-reflecting.
Yes.
And that's an interesting paradox that we have to have things pointed out. And in the dream, we're pointing out to ourselves that we're dreaming.
Yeah.
It's like this internal dialogue. But I think that's a weird paradox that there's always another perspective for pointing out.
Well, it's always other because when you're in a condition where pointing out isn't obvious or is unnecessary, then you're outside of frameworks. When you're in a condition where pointing out becomes relevant or necessary, you're relatively constrained in an interpretive framework where what would be pointed out isn't blatantly obvious. Mm-hmm. So it'll always be an outside, just because in that context there will be an inside.
Mm-hmm. We're in a jail that we released from.
Yeah, you seem to be in some context, and the pointing out instruction is that, oh, by the way, you're not actually.
Right. By the way, the door is.
If you're not in a context, pointing out instructions are irrelevant because they're obvious. You're not in anything. I know. Neither of you. Oh, I know. Cool. I pointed you out. You pointed me out. Ah. Yeah, I mean, pointing out always comes from radiant presence, and whatever the vehicle is, if it seems to come from someone's mouth or through just some flash of insight or a book or whatever, but it's that flash of recognition, a reminder from outside the context of whatever dullness was felt to be actualized.
When I get lost in the mirror maze, fortunately, it seems like there's always a voice that will say, there is no other. And then kind of relax with all the seeming separations.
Well, you're lucky to have that voice.
I feel very grateful.
Talk about the pointing out. I never had the beginning. What even led me to even going down this path originally 15 years ago. I had an experience to where wasn't somebody pointing something out to me. It's like it showed itself in a way which I thought I was sick. I thought I had something wrong with my brain. And I was walking my dog, but when it happened, it scared me. That just really spooked me. I thought I had either a tumor or something. That's how intense it was for me. And then after that, I was grabbing every book I could get my hands on.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. That's the best pointing out, when you just see it, bang. Wow, there's something here. This is amazing. What the fuck is it? And then you start grabbing around trying to get. Is anyone else saying anything that remotely relates to what I'm feeling?
Yeah, I'm from Texas, small town, Texas, redneck, of all things. I mean, I was thinking, what in the world happened to me? And it's until I started really diving in, I started kind of finding the path and finding out what's going on. But I would never have ever thought I would be sitting in here right now 15 years ago. Yeah, it's just it's magical.
It is magical. It really is magical. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Toku's in Texas.
What's that?
Toku's in Texas.
I don't I don't know about that, but I've got a long way to go, but I'll tell you, it is, I can't, it's a passion. It's become a passion. I can't get enough of it. I'm actually too attached to the passion of it.
Yeah, sure.
I feel,
Yeah.
you know, so.
Yeah. That's all good.
Find my way.
You're talking before about the suggested power of the self-hypnotizing mind, and it seems that the mind is able to hypnotize itself into holding paradoxical or contradicting suggestions.
Oh, yes. Sure.
Which is kind of shooting yourself in the leg in a sense.
Well, maybe yes. Maybe shooting someone else in the leg.
So how do you avoid that?
I don't know. What do you mean? I need
well, let's say a simplistic example. You say, explore auras of somebody else, and then I have this implicit suggestive thought beforehand. Oh, I can't read auras, and so if I go about doing that, nothing is really happening.
Well, no, you just overlay it. You see, if you say I can't read auras, and then you try to read an aura, and you can't do it.
I'm saying that is.
I understand, but no, I know what I'm saying is, if you say it and then with the implicit I can't read auras comes to the forefront, then you're actually reinstating that.
Sure.
The very act of trying to do it brings up you telling yourself I can't do this. Well, don't call it reading auras. Call it perceiving the flavors of the people around you. You meet someone, you get a hit on them right away. You like them or you don't like them or whatever, or they're weird or you think whatever. You know what I mean? You meet someone, you just the first instant you just see them and you know something about them, right? And so just do that. Don't call it reading auras. It's something you're already doing. I'm sure you're already doing it. I mean, you don't walk up to people and you just absolutely have no sense whatsoever of what they're like. I don't believe that. I don't think anyone's like that. Everyone, I mean, people will of course not conform to your expectations, but there's just something there that I think I can't imagine it's not obvious for someone. That's all I mean by aura.
Yeah, and I was using this just as an example.
Right, no, I understand.
What I find is that, there's just from the persona, long-held sort of suggestions that.
Sure, but don't worry about that because that's just an interpretive framework that you're used to identifying with.
Sure.
And in the course of other yogic explorations, like we've been talking about, will gradually diminish the strength of that kind of an orientation. The point of hypnosis is not necessarily to use it. The point of it is just to be aware of it. Notice how that happens. Notice how you're driving along and there's a street sign that says something and you think something about it. You wouldn't have thought of something about it if you hadn't seen the sign.
Right.
So the very fact that it provoked a reaction is this hypnotic mechanism kicking in. And so the point is just to become aware of that. The mind's, knee-jerk, automatic.
Right.
It turns things into something that you feel, that is actualized for you. And it happens externally, it also happens internally. So just from sort of random change of thought, you may have a jump, probably by hypnotic mechanism to some other thought, and all of a sudden that evokes something, and so you're sort of continually kind of feeling like you're in a movie of some kind to some degree, subliminally. But it's all created by this mechanism I'm talking about. And again, the point is not to stop it or not do it, just become aware of it. Notice that it's there. And then notice how the mind is immoral. It will take any seed and it will come up with something.
Seems to me like there's a mechanistic quality to that as we become more and more aware of all the projections that are made that when they no longer have weight or viability or importance, that there seems to be a diminishment of that, and that what does come up is just more engaging. Or I know it sounds like I'm talking about censorship, but I don't just talking about the just the flood of conceptual data that always seems to be flowing through, to just to enjoy it more and not lock down on it.
Yeah. You know, in my experience, as unfoldment occurs, by degrees or whatever, the investment and the seeming urgency of all of this diminishes. The mechanism itself may not diminish. The mind may still be churning out the gibberish, bullshit chains of thought constantly, and it may still have these mechanisms of instant reactivity to whatever. But the sense that actually means anything or matters, or that you need to follow it, or will tend to diminish. It's like the whole thing gets more ghostly, and it may diminish somewhat in its activity, but it may not. And the point is not to diminish it necessarily. The point is to see that it doesn't matter, so that then the urgency and the reactivity, the attachment to that is something that is good or bad, or I need to do something about it, or it matters in some sense, just diminishes and becomes eventually just disappear.
It's diminishment of self-importance too.
Yeah, exactly. Diminishment of self-importance. And this happens across the board. All the personality mechanisms are just churning it out. They're just doing what they do. And as one, as realization progresses, as unfoldment progresses, all of that mechanism still does its thing. But again, it just, the relevance and the urgency diminishes, because the context, formerly one thought this was me and it's all happening, and so this is all me and it really matters and it's really urgent. But as you get a vaster and vaster sense of yourself, you see that the personality and all of its mechanisms is a really quite a small mechanism in a much larger context, most of which is beyond that. And so the fact that this mechanism is having all this activity is not really, it recedes in the scope of things, in the scale of things. It just reveals itself to be smaller and smaller and less important, even if it's still ongoing. Because rather, when you're in ignorance, you inhabit the personality front and center. You're living in it, you're seeing through it, and so all of its little perturbations really matter. But eventually, the personality is like this. It's like a little cat you have. It's sort of over in the next room frolicking or something. It's just it's there, but it's just it's so small in the scope of things. It just doesn't really matter.
In this context, would you say a word about creativity? Which is sort of, if we think of that as sort of a bringing and arising into some kind of form and expression, clearly it doesn't mean anything, and yet that impulse arises.
Well, creativity is in one sense, everything is creativity. All appearance is creativity of what you actually are. So it's all your creativity. The creativity proper, in terms of what most people would consider it as, is just going to be an aspect of one's nature. Some people, different people have different degrees of expression. Some people make a lot of noise. Some people have a lot of movement. Some people like to manipulate matters, whatever. And so according to this nature, it will tend to manifest itself. And certainly in the context of yoga, one becomes less inhibited and more spontaneous, and perhaps less obsessive about one's creativity. But again, all in accordance with one's nature. It's important to, I haven't really emphasized this too much, I don't think, this weekend. And it's important to understand how absolutely unique everyone is. No one whatsoever is remotely like you. And no one is remotely like anyone else. And anyone is exactly, everyone's a one-off. And so the functioning of making generalizations about the functioning of any one person can't really be done. Because some people are really uniquely divergent from some imagined, more common mode. And so it's really a matter of what the energy system that you happen to consist of, what it is and what its nature is. Because that's what you have to work with. That's your strength and your medium. And it is, you can't, it's a mistake to look at it in terms of anything that supposedly applies to anyone else, because it might not apply to you. You might be different. And there's no limitation whatsoever to the degrees of difference that individual beings can manifest. Absolutely none. I mean, you can suppose that most people sort of roughly, in terms of their natures, roughly conform to some kind of bell curve. But that bell curve goes all the way out to infinity. And there's going to be some people that are just like so far from the body of the bell curve that you can't even see them. They're like over the horizon. So you never know.
That subject of individual uniqueness reminds me of Jung's idea of individuation. Being that we're all becoming ourselves better. Becoming fulfilling that individual quality we have. So there's a similarity in maybe the process of that, the steps involved in that, or the phases of that. But the actual content is completely unique and something for us to discover and break out of conditioning or.
Yeah. The content is unique, but also the relevant processes may be unique too. I mean, talking about, yoga, for example, in this context, what applies to most people may not apply to someone. And what applies to them may not apply to most people. So it's impossible to give blanket advice or say that, this is going to be useful. This is, all you can really do is just sort of hang out all the possibilities as a smorgasbord and hope and trust the inspiration and the inherent intelligence of the individual to have the wit to gravitate towards what's going to be valuable for them. But it's most important for the yogi to follow their nature and draw on their own strengths, which is that nature, which will be unique to them and may look drastically different than anything someone else is doing.
Like those Mahasiddha ideas where, you become a yogi through gambling or something.
Exactly. You can't, really, for real. You know, there's no barriers. There's no, there's no limits to what is possible. It's really just a matter of being true to what you actually are, and that's your business. Only you really know who you actually are, or the degree to which you can tune into that, even if you can't do it very well, is the degree to your ability to functionally draw on that strength and use it.
I find that to be the biggest challenge.
Well, everyone is. Everyone is. You're your own biggest asset, and you're also your own biggest impediment, and that's always the case, because but your nature is your strength, and your nature is your problem. So, and this is true across the board. So working with oneself is really what this is all about. Which is why it's really important to keep it first person. It's about you and your experience, and generalizations and objectifications and all that really don't apply, because it has to be real, and it's only real if you're actually experiencing it, if it's real for you, and that's what matters.
Do you think we can ever resolve irresolvability? The irresolvability.
You can resolve.
We are.
You never resolve irresolvability, but irresolvability doesn't eliminate nature.
If we relax with it, this is where our creativity lies.
Irresolvability increases your creativity, increases your nature by broadening the spectrum of what it contains and implies. You're more than whatever you think you are, and you're more than that, and more than that, and more than that, forever. And in that moreness, there is richness, there is lusciousness, and yet it doesn't cancel out to just sort of some averaging, It's still very precisely you, and very eccentrically your deviation in your own individual direction, even though it is infinite and unresolvable.
The more we go there, the more normal we are.
Yeah, but normalcy is your normalcy. It's not some normalcy that's some social normalcy. There's no consensus reality.
I love that paradox. This is, if I've understood, that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah. I mean, you inhabit your own universe, and that's the bottom line, beginning and ending. And so your laws are yours. Your rightness is yours. Your completeness is yours. Your normalcy is yours. Period. And you can't say anything whatsoever about anyone else, and no one else can say anything whatsoever about you. Because I can't see from inside. No matter how intimately you connect with someone, they're still, you're in them and they're in you. They can't be in you.
Say that again.
I said it badly. So there can be absolute intimacy. I mean, you can have a meeting of minds that's inconceivably transparent and profound, but still in all, that meeting, the meeting of, like you suppose if you and me are just completely intimately locked, that locking happens in my experience for me, and that locking happens in your experience for you, and it's not actually a common locking. I mean, that doesn't say it's not true, but it just is like that. The structure of it is weird.
Yeah.
And what it will mean to you won't be the same as what it means to me.
Because we're different.
Because we're in different universes.
Yeah.
And it can't be bridged. There's no, it cannot be done.
In that context, what about omniscience?
You have omniscience. But the omniscience that you have is, you know all that there is, and all that there is what you know. There's nothing outside of your knowledge, of your experience.
Okay, and that supersedes a sense of my universe, your universe.
No, your universe is my universe, your universe is theoretical. That's for the purposes of me talking to you.
Okay.
There's really only my universe.
Thanks for accommodating us.
And you're free to say, no, there's only my universe. But that's your business. As a teaching device, I'm talking about, it's very strange. You live in your own universe and there are no other universes. And I live in my own universe and there are no other universes. How does that work? You can't say. It doesn't make any sense. It's entirely miraculous and mysterious, but there you go. But it's obvious. It's just pragmatism. It is, it's empirically, you can't, everything that exists for you exists in your experience. And you are the only observer of that, all that phenomena. And that phenomena, as it appears to you, appears to no one else. Your own universe. And no one else can ever look inside your universe without just seeing a version of it in their universe, which will not be the same as it looks from inside to you.
And yet that could be their experience of omniscience.
Well, omniscience is whatever is there. You know all because nothing exists but what you know. There's nothing outside your universe. Albuquerque doesn't exist right now. Albuquerque, it may exist as a thought in the dimension of thought, but it doesn't exist in your sensoria, so it doesn't exist. And as you travel, things come into being and things go out of being. You close your eyes and the whole world disappears. You open them and the whole world appears. But when you close your eyes and the world disappears, it's not like something you've lost anything. Nothing's missing. Because the world was never there. It's only there if it's there in your experience. And again, this is just empiricism. It's just it's self-evident. Look and see. Try and find something else. Anything other than that is a fantasy. It's literally a fantasy. So we can talk about New York, and New York. Talking about New York is the thought of New York, the fantasy of New York. Because I can't say, take New York and say, here's New York. There's no difference saying, here's Santa Claus. It's a fantasy.
But isn't that no different than saying, there's a tree? Because that's my idea of a tree on this sensory experience.
I don't follow you. If you say there's a tree, that's the thought of a tree.
Yes.
If you're seeing something that you're pointing at when you say it's a tree,
that's the basis of the label.
Then that's the experiential basis of what you're claiming in thought is a tree,
right.
which itself is not a tree. It's not anything. It's just whatever it is. So I'm not following where you're going with that.
Well, it's the same. I guess it's the same tendency to project our label and think it's the thing. We project New York as this concept.
Right.
We project the tree as the concept.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. It's the same thing. But in the dearth of a New York to project it onto, all you have is the label.
Yeah.
So let's talk about New York. We're talking about labels because there is no New York to talk about.
Okay.
This is more clear right now because if you're in New York, it's a similar situation.
Well, if you're in New York, then there's no Santa Fe.
Even there's no New York. I mean,
well, sure.
Find it. And
yeah, sure. It's the same
concept.
Thing. Well, all of that. I mean, this gets to the correlation between concepts and sensory actuality, which will always diverge. I mean, Santa Fe. This isn't Santa Fe. This is this living room. Right. So I don't see any Santa Fe.
Very small city.
Yeah, exactly. And so on and so forth. So again, but labels always go to abstractions, which are never true. A very, 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 very important principle to bear in mind. Experience is made of specifics, and experience is not made of generalities. Generalities are not real, specifics are real, and specifics are actual experience. So of anything that is a category is a generality, so it doesn't actually exist. Forks don't exist. Cups don't exist. This cup exists. But it's not a cup, because the category of cups don't exist. This exists. So it's a way of sort of parsing the a logic of reality in terms of real-time experience versus labeling it versus categorizing it. So I can say, this cup or this it, and I'm indicating an actuality, but I'm not categorizing it, except by saying this, and this is always a true category if it is this, because this is this. This means present, and this is present. So this is this. So in terms of a scale of logic of indication, that's close to actual. In terms of going to generalities, this is a cup. All of a sudden, I'm leaping to a generalization abstraction, and the reality is not there at all. That is entirely fantasy. Anyhow, we can get it. That's kind of opening a big door. And I suggest we knock off for lunch. It's 12:15, so we can meet here back around 2-ish or straggle in whenever you do, and we'll stumble on.